The Russia-Ukraine war is reaching a critical turning point, reshaping both the battlefield and global diplomacy. Deadly Russian missiles and drone strikes continue to hit Ukrainian civilian centers, including a major shopping complex. In response, Kiev is reportedly preparing advanced AI drone counterstrikes. Diplomatically, the landscape is shifting. France is rallying a coalition of the willing to sustain support even as European war fatigue grows. Meanwhile, Moscow is signaling openness to new ideas for peace, provided they match its strategic goals, all while deepening military ties with North Korea and facing domestic anxiety over renewed mobilization. From Ukraine's unsold grain to rising drone incursions near NATO airspace, the global ripple effect is intensifying. Stay with us as we break down these crucial developments. I'm Rehan Morsi, and this is In Focus. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky faces intense pressure from relentless missile attacks and a severe grain blockade. Internally, corruption scandals and demands for early voting threaten his government's stability, making his urgent appeals for advanced air defenses highly critical today. As winter approaches, European allies are showing clear signs of war fatigue. Citizens and fringe political factions increasingly view the prolonged conflict as a heavy financial burden. Meanwhile, Kiev heavily relies on massive drone strikes, utilizing vital Western technology partnerships to strike enemy targets. A targeted Ukrainian drone strike hit Russia's Akhtubanetsk airbase overnight, damaging a multi-role Su-34 fighter bomber. Located over 400 miles from the front lines, the strategic facility serves as Moscow's primary military aircraft testing center. The Su-34 plays a vital operational role in launching heavy guided bombs and conducting electronic warfare missions. Thermal satellite analysis confirmed fire signatures on the airfield, indicating significant damage to the advanced warplane. This bold raid underlines Kiev's growing strategy of deep penetration attacks inside Russia, but targeting key military centers and energy infrastructures. Ukrainian forces are actively disrupting Moscow's logistical capabilities. To talk to us more about this, we're joined from Kiev by Mr. Peter Dickinson, the Ukraine editor at Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining this evening here on In Focus. Let's start by asking about Ukraine. How does Ukraine's reported deployment of these AI-driven drone swarms against Russian airfields shift the balance strategically when it comes to deep strike capabilities?
I don't think there's any major significance in this. I think we've got to look at the bigger picture. Ukraine now is able to strike up to 3,000 kilometers in some cases, certainly 2,000 kilometers on numerous occasions inside Russia at a variety of different targets. So I don't think there's any one weapon system here that is decisive. I think we're talking more about a fairly steady expansion of Ukraine's strike capabilities.
Okay, so basically it's the drones that sort of gave the Ukrainians an advantage, not necessarily AI-driven drones.
Exactly, yes. I mean, Ukraine has basically bet on drones heavily. When the war began in 2022, or when the full-scale Russian invasion began in 2022, it was clear to Ukraine that they really couldn't match Russia in a conventional sense. Obviously, Russia is far larger, is far wealthier, has much greater resources. So Ukraine needed to find ways to fight back asymmetrically. And it was Ukraine's made a strategic bet on drones very early on, and that bet has paid off with dividends, very significantly. We've seen them expand their capabilities on the battlefield at sea, and also, especially, I would say, long-range strikes inside Russia. So now there are hundreds of Ukrainian companies producing drones, many of them very innovative models, and the capabilities they have, as we see from the evidence of the strikes, is expanding on a weekly basis almost.
So, how vital are Western technological partnerships in enabling Ukraine's shift, or this massive shift, and that's coordinating drone strikes on enemy military targets? Um, will other partners be useful in this, or are the Ukrainians doing quite well on their own when it comes to the drone technology?
Well, there is a big role for foreign partners here in technologies. A lot of the technologies Ukraine uses that they've taken from partners or even just third parties like the Chinese, and they've adapted it to military conditions, to the current conditions of the war. So it's not all being built from scratch in Ukraine by any means, but Ukraine is certainly adapting it. They're developing new strategies, new tactics. They are upgrading available technology. So I think from a purely technological point of view, in terms of the drones themselves, let's say, Ukraine's doing a pretty good job. They have a significant degree of autonomy, and they don't rely, they don't depend on any particular Western partners to maintain that. The area where Western technological support is really crucial is in terms of targeting. The West has access to certain capabilities to map Russia, to identify targets, and to help strike in Russia that Ukraine doesn't have, and they're reliant on that. So I think if they were to lose this intel support, this targeting support from Western partners, that would be a blow. It wouldn't stop Ukraine because they could still be producing the drones, but the attacks would not be as accurate, they would not be as effective. So I think it's really a case at the moment, at least, in terms of the drone war, where the Western role is primarily in terms of supporting and enhancing Ukraine's targeting abilities.
Well, Russia now is claiming the capture of 11 settlements. How is Ukraine adapting its defensive posture to protect the civilian infrastructure there from the relentless missile barrages? Does the Western aspect of what you just discussed there of intel help in maintaining a defensive posture?
No, the Western targeting plays no role in a defensive sense whatsoever. Ukraine at the moment is extremely vulnerable to Russian missile attacks, as we see. The civilian death toll is rising month by month now for, I think, the last 4 or 5 months. In the month of July, Ukraine saw, I think, more than 3,000 people were killed or wounded in civilians, that is, in Russian airstrikes. That figure represents a 70% increase on the same period, July, 1 year earlier. So a very sharp rise in the number of Ukrainian civilians who are being killed here, and that speaks for the damage that's being done. Russia is exploiting Ukraine's weakness at the moment in air defenses, in particular in terms of ballistic missiles. The only effective air defense system against ballistic missiles is the US-made Patriot system, but there simply aren't enough interceptors for this system to be used by Ukraine. Ukraine has a number of these systems. It has no interceptors. It has no ammunition, essentially. So these systems are just standing by idly now, and Ukraine is, to all extents and purposes, defenseless against Russian ballistic missile strikes. So, of all of the categories Russia's using to bomb Ukraine, drones and cruise missiles, Ukraine has pretty effective defenses. Many of them provided or supported by Ukraine's partners. A lot of the drone interceptors produced by Ukraine itself. But the ballistic missiles is the big problem, and Ukraine really has no defense against them at the moment. They're wide open, and we see that in the damage that's being done by the Russians.
So could the US provide this interceptor for the ballistic missiles within the near future, or is this not something that's going to be possible soon?
I think it's very unlikely. I mean, the US has some stocks, some reserves, but they've depleted their own supplies, their own reserves, very, very heavily over the last 6 months since the campaign against Iran began in late February, the end of February. The Americans have burned through a very large amount. I think the figures I've seen, they had around 2.5.
Well, also internally in Ukraine, things are not quite going so well for them there. Facing the internal corruption
Yeah, so
scandals
the
and demands
Americans
for
really
political
don't have
reform.
any to spare at the moment, and they'd be very reluctant to hand any over. If they
Yes.
were going to hand any over, they'd probably be giving them, they'd prioritize giving them to their partners in the Gulf, who are also engaged in this war against Iran. So Ukraine is now in a very difficult position. They can't get the missiles, the interceptor missiles from America's stocks. They're unlikely to get many from their European partners, who also have some but are very reluctant to hand them over. And there's not enough being produced. Again, if we look at the numbers, the company in America that produces these interceptors that currently is producing around 600 a year. Ukraine's needs are estimated at between 1,000 and 2,000. So, realistically, Ukraine may receive some interceptors in the coming months, but it's going to be a fraction of what they need. So the Ukraine needs to think of alternatives of how to minimize the impact of what is very likely to be an extremely severe ballistic missile blitz.
Yes, well, they're not only facing external problems but also internal problems. Now, the corruption scandals and demands for political reform are also an issue for Ukraine. How is President Zelensky balancing domestic stability with, as you said, the urgent needs for wartime unity?
His priority is, Zelensky is first and foremost a war leader. I think, domestic political issues are essentially a distraction for him at this point. He needs to focus on the war, but he is being dragged into domestic issues because politics continues, life continues. Ukraine remains a large European country with all of the, daily life that you would expect in any major European state. So there are a lot of political issues he's got to deal with. And recently he's been hit by a number of scandals. And, these scandals revolving around corruption, favoritism, accusations of deeply entrenched vested interests in at first it's someone involved in the defense ministry, then the presidential administration, and it's only a matter of time, I think, before people start pointing a finger. In fact, they already are saying, well, Zelensky has to be involved himself here. He has to be culpable. So he's losing, I would say, a lot of his credibility with the Ukrainian public. Now, I don't think that's going to be a crisis just yet, because at the moment there is an understanding in Ukraine that Zelensky serves an important purpose as a war leader, that he's needed by the country. But I think once the war is over, once Ukraine is able to hold elections again in a safe environment, I would already suggest that it's very unlikely that he would be re-elected.
Well, as you said, he's a wartime president, and now there are reports of mounting war fatigue and financial strain across European capitals who have traditionally supported Kiev. How can Kiev sustain the political momentum needed to continue their advanced air defense support and continue battling Russia?
I think Ukraine, as strange as it might sound, I think Ukraine's main ally in that quest is Russia, because Russia is escalating rapidly against Europe. Russia is carrying out a wide range of so-called hybrid war activities against Europe, which, frankly speaking, have now got to the stage where it's hard to say what's hybrid war and what's not hybrid war, what's real war. Where does the boundary lie? But we're seeing Russian cruise missiles striking in European territory. We're seeing Russian drones. Just a day or two ago, there was an armed Russian naval drone that was intercepted close to a strategic object just off the coast of Romania in the Black Sea. So we're seeing these aggressive Russian actions in the grey zone, so to speak. So not quite at the threshold of a conventional war, but aggressive, in many cases, military actions carried out by Russia. And that sends a shockwave through European the political establishment, if not the public at this stage. They know that they are not prepared for the threat posed by Russia. They're simply very much exposed. And they look at, if you're a European, you're looking around, you're thinking, we're facing a very aggressive, very expansionist, very ambitious Russian regime here. And where's our security going to come from? Well, the Americans have been clear that they're not going to provide it anymore. Donald Trump has been very, very clear that he does not want to be heavily engaged in European security. Now he's also angry about Europe's response to his war against Iran. So Europe at the moment, really, if they're looking for security, the obvious partner here is Ukraine, the biggest army in Europe. So I think that's going to be the biggest motivating factor for Europeans, regardless of what Zelensky may or may not do. The Europeans are going to say, well, we need Ukraine, so we better support them.
Well, as you said, Russia may be pushing the Europeans towards a more defensive stance there, and France is rallying a coalition as a willing. Do you think that this framework could effectively grow, or rather decrease the hesitations among some European allies who may be slightly on the fence about, defense and Russia and what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, the coalition of willing is not actually new. I mean, this may be a new aspect of this initiative, but that's been underway for some time. But I mean, I think it's all about, it's recognizing that, we talk about Europe, but actually Europe is not a single entity. Europe is really a geographical, or perhaps at most an economic term. There is no European foreign policy, for example. It doesn't make any sense to talk about that. There's no European defense policy, and so on. So if we talk about engagement with Ukraine and support for Ukraine, I think it is important to bring together those countries beyond the framework of the European Union or Europe as a whole, to bring together the countries who are prepared to take action, who are prepared to do more, and have them work together. Because, of course, there's going to be differences. There's a lot of countries in Europe that don't feel threatened by Russia, that feel that their interests are best served by trying to appease Russia or to be on good terms with Russia, or want to do business with Russia even. So there's a lot of complex national interests here to balance. But there are a number of countries, I would say probably a majority, but certainly a lot of countries in Europe who do understand Russia to be a major security threat, a long-term security threat, and they want to take action against it. And again, if they want to do that, the best way to do that, as well as developing strengthening their own security, is to support Ukraine and have Ukraine play a stronger role there, and to hold, essentially, to serve as the front line of this confrontation with the Russians. So, I think no one in Europe, we've got to be realistic, no one in Europe's going to go to war on Ukraine's behalf. No one's going to invade Russia or fight Russia, or we see that we see this caution all the time. But they can certainly come together and work together in order to strengthen Ukraine's position and to provide Ukraine with more of what the Ukrainians need in order to defend themselves.
Well, earlier in the conversation, you talked about the death toll in Ukraine and how it's rising. It's also rising in Russia as well, and there's growing mobilization fear there as well. How sustainable is the Kremlin's current war economy and domestic public approval? Surely they must be facing issues when it comes to having young men join the army.
Well, Putin has been very, very careful to minimize any public backlash about the war. I mean, if we look at the available information, we have no confirmed figures, but we have various different sources, various different investigations into the available open source data that seem to be quite conclusive that Russia has lost certainly hundreds of thousands of men, perhaps as many as 500,000 men. So it's been a massive, massive number of losses by any standards. I don't think anyone would debate that, and yet there's been no backlash at all. And that's not an accident. That actually is a sign of the success of Putin's strategy. What he's done is to avoid having any mass mobilizations. They did that once in 2022, and it was very unpopular. And he's not done it since. Since then, Russia has basically gone into the prisons and drawn out the prison population. So they've taken in tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of convicts of people who were in prison, many of them for very serious crimes. They've emptied the prisons out now. They've almost exhausted that source, but that's helped them replenish their army. They've also gone into the poorest regions of Russia, the deepest provinces, and recruited there. Again, people a long way from the big cities who don't have much of a voice, especially those who belong to ethnic minority communities. And crucially, and I think most of all, they've gone and offered very large amounts of money to Russians to volunteer. They've said, we'll pay you very well to come and fight in Ukraine. And if you are wounded or killed, we'll pay you even more. We'll give your family massive compensation. So, these people are dying in large numbers. We see that every day. There's that's clear. But I think the attitude in Russia up to now, certainly what we can gauge from Russian public opinion, is that most people look at it and say, well, okay, these people died, but they knew what they were doing. They were going to fight for money. They knew there was a risk. They took the risk because they wanted the money. And that happened to them. I don't think people aren't celebrating the fact, but I think that there's not a level of sympathy that you would expect in Russia that you would have if, for example, they were conscripts. If people were being forced to go and fight in Ukraine and then they were dying, I think there would be a completely different attitude, or a very different attitude, let's say. But that's not the case. These people are volunteers. They're volunteering to go to war because they want money. and they're being basically paid for it. They're essentially mercenaries in this sense. So Putin's been very clever with that. Of course, at some point, he'll run out of people who are prepared to go and fight for money. But I don't think we're at that point yet. I think that's still a long way away. We'll see.
All right. Well, we're out of time for this segment, but thank you so much for joining this evening. That was Peter Dickinson, Ukraine editor at Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining in this evening, and thank you for your insights. Efforts to implement the Gaza ceasefire and the US-backed roadmap remain stalled as Israel continues to carry out deadly attacks in the Strip while rejecting key elements of the proposed framework. Egypt, alongside Qatar and Turkey, have condemned the latest Israeli strikes and called on Israel to fulfill obligations under the ceasefire. Cairo has remained at the center of the diplomatic efforts, pushing for implementation, humanitarian access, and a transition towards reconstruction, while the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate, with nearly 94% of Gaza's population in need of shelter and basic assistance. Egypt Today reports that Egypt and Turkey have stressed that the ball is now in Israel's court to implement President Donald Trump's peace plan for Gaza after Palestinian factions responded positively to efforts concerning the restriction of weapons. The Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdulati and his Turkish counterpart Hakan Fidan called for sustained pressure on Israel to fulfill commitments under the first phase of the plan and a broader roadmap. The minister said implementation must include an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, the unhindered entry of humanitarian aid, including the agreed target of around 600 aid trucks per day, and the removal of obstacles to early recovery and reconstruction. He also called for enabling the new Palestinian administration, Palestinian police, and the International Stabilization Force to enter Gaza, paving the way for the planned second phase and a more durable ceasefire. The two sides also warned that Israel's E1 settlement project in the occupied West Bank would further undermine territorial continuity and prospects for an independent Palestinian state, describing it as a flagrant violation of international law. To talk to us more about this, joining us this evening from Jenin is Norman El-Abed, a political analyst. Thank you for joining us here on In Focus. Let's start by asking about Egypt and Turkey. Now, they have been at the center of the mediation efforts and have repeatedly pushed for the implementation of the roadmap in Gaza. How significant is Cairo's role at this juncture?
You, Ms. Riham, and thank you so much for having me. No doubt, the Egyptian role has always been standing with the Palestinian right and supporting the Palestinian right since the occupation started. And we're aware that the Arab Republic of Egypt and the Egyptian leadership throughout history has always been supporting the establishment of the two-state solution and going through this conflict through diplomatic channels to end the occupation on the Palestinian territories. And since the start of this genocide in the Gaza Strip, there have been Egyptian efforts exerted by all Egyptian state institutions. They have been very proactive to suggest solutions and to lead the mediation efforts to end the genocide and to stop the evacuation ideas adopted by the Benjamin Netanyahu government. And therefore, there has been this unwavering stance by the Egyptian Foreign Affairs to stop the evacuation schemes, as they have significant meaning in liquefying the and liquidating the Palestinian cause by evacuating the Palestinian population from their lands. And therefore, the Egyptian stance has been always clear and steady. And even when President Trump suggested some evacuation schemes, the Egyptian leadership rejected them all. And the Egyptian mediation continue to implement the Trump peace agreement, they and it is now trying to pressure the Israeli occupation to follow through with the second and third phases of the peace agreement. And we know that Egypt has several good international relations to apply pressure on Israel. There has been visits by several international delegations to the Rafah crossing to voice the Palestinian needs. And we have seen the two-state solution conference in New York with the Egyptian participation, and we appreciate this effort. And even domestically, the Egyptian authorities has very good relations with the with the Palestinian Authority, and Egypt has been investing this effort and this role to bridge the gaps of and differences inside Palestine, and this can pressure the world and pressure Israel into stopping their violations and constant assaults. Egypt has always been saying that there must be a unified Arab stance to unify the Palestinian vision, the Palestinian forces against the occupation. The Egyptian stance has been historic and supporting to the Palestinian right, and we wouldn't forget the quantities of humanitarian assistance that the Egyptian leadership and the Egyptian people have been entering into Palestine. I have seen it firsthand from the Egyptian Red Crescent when I was in Egypt. Huge quantities of assistance waiting to enter the Gaza Strip, only if it weren't for the Israeli forces stopping these relief supplies from entering the strip.
Well, if we could talk about the Israeli aspect of it. Now, Israel continues to link reconstruction and withdrawal to the complete disarmament of Hamas. Is this a genuine negotiating position, or is it a way to put obstacles to implement the ceasefire framework and a way to hinder moving on to the second phase?
Before the ceasefire agreement, the Egyptian state has been aware that the reconstruction for the Palestinian people can save a lot of lives. We are aware that the occupation state has demolished more than 80% of the infrastructure and buildings in the Gaza Strip, including mosques, hospitals, and homes, and therefore the Palestinian people are now without shelter in the Gaza Strip. So the reconstruction is first and foremost to provide shelter and to stop the evacuation schemes and policies. Now the people in Gaza are completely without shelter, and this can facilitate the evacuation idea adopted by the Benjamin Netanyahu government. There was a conference here held in Cairo only for the sole purpose of supporting reconstruction. And as for the disarmament, it's not only about the mediating parties, Egypt and Turkey and so on, but the main obstacle here is the Benjamin Netanyahu government stalling over and over not to move to the second phase. Even the first phase was not fully implemented, the humanitarian protocol was not followed as it should, and the ceasefire was not implemented as it should.
Well, it's an
So
interesting
far,
point there, sir. I mean, now we're seeing an increase or intensification of Israeli strikes on the Gaza Strip. Do you think that this is intentional and, in a way, damaging the credibility and viability of the ceasefire itself? Are the Israelis attempting to basically demolish the ceasefire?
Commit to its end of the bargain, did not commit to its end of the ceasefire after the announcement of President Donald Trump and the Sharm el Sheikh summit and the Security Council resolution. There must have been a ceasefire once both parties agree to the agreement. The Palestinian factions agreed to the ceasefire and committed to all the items, but Israel did not. And that's why Israel is sending messages that they do not want to follow through with the Donald Trump plan and with the 15 item plan. And we're aware that the Israeli election campaigns are adding a new factor to the stubbornness of this far right government that is now placing its bet on the extremist vote inside Israel. And I think, and I can say for sure that this government during the upcoming period will not work to achieve the ceasefire agreement. And these commitments must be followed through by Israel. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu government are trying to get out of this agreement, and they did not commit from the first place, even if their resistance is disarmed, they will not follow through with their commitments. A new government should be there soon, and we shall see what's going to happen.
Okay, well, also, as you've mentioned earlier in the conversation, a vast majority of the population is in dire need for basic needs here. 94% of Gaza's population reportedly needs shelter, basic assistance, access to medical care, and so forth. What does this humanitarian reality mean for the urgency of implementing the next phase of the plan and, pushing the Israelis, I suppose, who can push the Israelis into allowing these urgent needs into the Gaza Strip?
It is a tragic and catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip at the moment. First of all, the occupation forces are on 70% of the area of the Gaza Strip. So far, the Palestinians are not allowed to enter these parts, and the Israeli forces are working to change the demographics and geography of this area. Only 30% of the Gaza area have the entire Palestinian populations, and in this weather without shelter, in this very warm weather, they are pushing for the evacuation scheme. And due to the lack of hygiene and sanitation, and without any basic needs, and this is of course deliberate, even the medical staff, physicians, nurses, and paramedics now are suffering to work under these conditions. That's why it's a very tragic situation with chronic diseases not being treated as they should be treated, cancer patients, diabetic patients, and several other patients are not getting their treatments. Hundreds and thousands require urgent
Sir, I understand, but
surgeries.
unfortunately we're out of time. Understandably so, the situation in Gaza is extremely dire. Hopefully there will be a solution there. That was Norman Al-Abed, a political analyst. Thank you for joining in this evening, and thank you for your insights. This brings us to the end of this episode of In Focus. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more here on Q News.